So Smarter Markets is back in Lausanne, Switzerland for the 15th edition of the FT Commodities Global Summit. And we're fortunate to be joined by Gracelin Baskaran, the founding director of the Critical Mineral Security Program at CSI, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. So good to meet you, Gracelin.
So good to be here. Sorry, it's a really long title.
I hope I got through it okay.
Perfect.
And, it's really interesting. I love your perspective because the one thing I've noticed at the conference this year is the shift of the agenda topics and so much more conversation on metals, critical metals and minerals in particular. And I was curious for you, how much have you seen the conversation shifting this year?
It's funny, if 5-10 years ago, traders kind of were their corner little gathering of the world. But what you start to see is a stronger government presence at these. We had multiple people from the U.S. government here. We have miners here. You have capital markets here. And I think a lot of that is realizing that if we don't get the flow of minerals right, every part of the economy can come to a standstill. And we saw that last year. So we stopped thinking about minerals in a little bit of a vacuum that traders move around and more of a end-to-end supply chain.
And what do you think traders, policymakers, what do they need to understand about this space to be able to understand each other and to help us move forward in a better way?
The common through line between these two groups of people is actually how do you make these supply chains economic, right? People are only going to mine these things and move these materials if they're going to make money. And the question is, what is the delta between the current state of the world, whether it's logistics costs, right? Ports, rail, whether it's prices being low because of market manipulation from a bad actor, whether it is a shortage of certain materials. The question is, how do we make it economic? And that's where these discussions are really, really important, right? Because often with a little bit of support, like a bridge to bankability notion, right? These projects can run, the materials can move, and you can create more resilient supply chains.
I'd love to dive into the bridge to bankability. What do you think governments can be doing to help make the investments on the mining, production, distribution side more bankable and get more of the investment that we're going to need?
So there's two sets of policy challenges we can look at, right? One is stability. So in this particularly, a lot of our traders here are going to be looking at Africa, Latin America, Asia, where you see a lot of policy change. If they don't feel confident that the framework in terms of export controls, in terms of the tax framework, in terms of beneficial ownership is going to stay constant, then it's really hard to make an investment that could be anywhere from 50 to 100 plus years, right? Mines run for a very long time. The second set of challenges we look at is actually things like offtake, price stability, concessional financing, because historically capital markets haven't actually moved very effectively when it comes to minerals. And a lot of that, our U.S. Interior Secretary, Doug Burgum, he said recently, mining is like a very unprofitable hedge fund, right? And part of that is in the U.S., it's 29 years to get a mine off the ground. So your money can sit for 29 years, or you can go put it in a tech ETF and you know where you're going to make money. So a lot of that is going to come back down to how do we ensure that these processes, these permits are moving faster. And that's going to be really crucial to get these investments going.
Yeah. And speaking of moving fast, as you said, 29 years, long time for projects. And I think a lot of folks on the mining side would say China's probably 15 years ahead, at least, of what we're doing outside of China in this space. So it's important that policymakers are doing what they can do to help get new investments made. But how difficult is it going to be to build up that capacity in the West? And how long of a project is this going to be?
There's a part of me that's really optimistic because I don't know that there's a year in the last 40 years that minerals have gotten this much attention at a policy level, right? So you have unprecedented use of concessional financing, equity investments, public procurement. It's like a deals moment, right? Even for governments. We've seen the U.S., Australian, and Japanese government co-finance a project, right? The reality is it's not about whether there's enough interest or even whether there's enough money going out the door. It's actually the time. So these supply chain shortages last year when China restricted rare earths, it was 6 weeks before Ford stopped manufacturing in Chicago, which means the decisions made in Beijing in a matter of weeks was making it to factory floors in Chicago. Well, we can't, no matter how much money we pour into rare earths, we are not getting a project up and running in 6 weeks. So it's more of the fact that even though we're putting in, I think, all the right steps, there's that time delay because it's a long-term industry that I can't turn on. Look, the reality is 5 years from now, we're going to be more resilient. We won't be completely resilient, be more resilient. And I think, again, you say 15 years, I might be generous, might be 30, but 15 years from now will be even better.
And one of the things that came up, I wanted to ask you about this in some of the panels yesterday. It almost sounded like the idea of building a strategic petroleum reserve for critical minerals to prevent the sort of thing that you talked about with the car companies. Is that something that's going to happen?
Yeah, so Project Vault was announced in February this year. And so the interesting thing is we've had a national defense stockpile for a long time. And the national defense stockpile, as its name, is only used for defense. So it started in 1939. And we're in a bit of a deja vu moment because when President Roosevelt wrote his letter to Congress for the stockpile, he said, I'm concerned that we could be dangerously low on critical materials we need and we could be going to war, right? Which is interesting because that's a little bit of the mindset we have today. And so when you fast forward to the economic security stockpile, it's actually saying, look, if our commercial, like our civilian technologies, whether it's those cars in Chicago, whether it's semiconductors, whether it's any form of energy, those are going to require minerals. But today, if there's a supply chain disruption, we have no backstop. But what's more important, I think, and we can't lose sight of this, is we have this really bad historical pattern, like short-termism, where we invest in our stockpile, we sell it off, we invest, we sell. So if you look between 1990 and 2024, we sold off 97% of our stockpile because after the Cold War, we thought wars will be short, easy, quick. We don't need to hold this much. And the reality is we did, because here we are trying to rebuild those things. And so with that vein is we have to make sure that policy is consistent and doesn't move in the waves of, oh, there's a crisis, we need to build and then we can sell, because that's part of our problem.
And speaking of wars, of course, there's a lot of conversation about the conflict in Iran right now. How do you see that affecting the critical minerals space?
Look, logistical corridors are a huge part of minerals, right? At the end of the day, the way minerals move often from where they come out of to where they are processed is not over land because often they have to move continents. And so in that vein, when we think about what resilient supply chains look like, a huge part of the consideration is, are there reliable logistical options? Is there a plan B option to get material from two places? The second part of it is Project Vault, this economic security stockpile. The materials have to be held in the United States. So they can come from anywhere, even China, but they have to be held in the US. And part of the reason is if you did have a logistical disruption, we still need to ensure that we can access those materials or it's not very useful.
And given China's dominance in the space right now and that it will take us a long time to catch up, how do you think we need to be thinking politically about the relationship with China and the scope for collaboration?
It's a very complex question as someone who sits in Washington, I have to say. Look, the reality is right now we are kind of at a bit of there's been a cool down in the temperature of the relationship, right? Is there a world where close collaboration is likely? Hard to tell because China is still looking at Taiwan and we're also looking at Taiwan. It's also coming up to a midterm election in the US, another presidential election. So, if I could predict the future of the world, I'd be a lot wealthier than I am today. I think the reality is we are still deeply dependent on China. But, I think the real question is this. Look, you can't go to an African country and say China is bad and America is good. They don't buy that. But what I think most people in the world agree on is that diversified supply chains is healthy, right? Having all of your supply in one country's hands is a massive economic and security risk. So it's not about necessarily saying China has to be, zero, but it's saying that economic diversification is a really healthy thing for everyone.
And before you go, I wanted to ask you, as a participant at the conference, is there anything that you've heard that was kind of a uniquely interesting idea that's come up this week, for good or bad? Like either people misunderstanding something that they need to understand better or something that is changed the way you're thinking about it?
It's a great question. I mean, I think traders are such an important part of the the landscape. And I think there's a bit disconnect between traders and policymakers, right? And understanding the economics of these supply chains, where things are held, how things are moved, has to be a bigger part of how we do our policy planning. A lot of these traders have been at this conference. They talk about how this is their 13th year on this stage. They have a long-term thinking that is actually really important for policymakers to adapt.
Terrific. Well, thanks so much for joining us. It's terrific to meet you.
Thanks for having me.